Hey, and welcome back. So I want to make one or two, or maybe more, videos about the Streamlit side of your project repository. So Streamlit, remember, is what we're using for creating the front end, what the end user would interact with in a real application. And so, as you may recall, that is covered, the code for that is in the app folder inside the project repository, the project template repository. As a reminder, just so you'll kind of know what's happening, whenever the container for Streamlit gets created, the thing that gets run is home.py. Okay, so that's the home.py that's right here. Now you might wonder, okay, so why don't we have to prepend it with source or whatnot? And it's essentially because we are mapping inside the Docker Compose file, which is covered in a previous video, the source folder into this appco folder. So that's sort of why we're able to do that. Okay, so that means that the starting point for the Streamlit application is this home.py folder. I'm sorry, file. Now, whenever you build a standard Streamlit application, the panel on the left-hand side of the screen is automatically generated for you based upon whatever pages you have. But because we are attempting to implement or sort of simulate a user logging in by clicking a button on this home page, we need to use an alternative method for creating the links on the left-hand side of the page based upon whichever user is quote-unquote logged in. So the first thing we need to do is we need to tell Streamlit not to use its default panel. So the way we do that is through the Streamlit config. So this should already be done for you. I just want you to know where it is. So inside the .streamlit folder, there should be a config.toml file. And it is this this setting right here, which turns off the standard sidebar navigation that Streamlit provides. So we're going to provide our own. Okay, so where is that custom navigation created? So inside the modules folder, there's a nav.py. And what you'll notice is basically for each one of the pages that are inside the pages folder, I've set up a function that essentially adds it to the sidebar. So st.sidebar is the sidebar, the customized sidebar that we're essentially creating. Okay, so I have one, let's say, for each of the pages. Now let's just say you wanted to add, for one function you wanted to add a couple different pages. You can see here you can add actually a few. The reason I've done them individually is because it would allow you to create different groupings of pages based upon whichever user was using the system. So how do I do that using system? I'm sorry, a subset of pages for which user is using the system, and that comes from down here in the sidebar links function. First things first is to the sidebar we add a logo file. This is just the Northeastern, the big N for Northeastern. You are more than welcome to change it. In fact, I encourage you to. You can use, some sort of generative AI to generate a logo for your application. Anyhow, it would go inside the assets folder right here. And then if you don't use logo.png, just change the name. Then I'll talk a little bit more about authentication when we look at the home page, the landing page for the application. But basically, we're always tracking whether or not a user is quote-unquote logged into the system, meaning they've authenticated, or they're not authenticated. Now remember, we're not doing username and password login. We're simulating that. And so the simulation for that is in the home.py folder, which we'll look at in a second. Now, if we're not authenticated and well, if we're not authenticated or the user's not authenticated, we want Streamlit to essentially redirect or switch to the home.py page. And that will help redirect the user to the home page. I mean, that's pretty straightforward. Okay, the good stuff is down here. If streamlit.sessionState equals authenticated, and I'll show you where that gets set in a second, basically for each user type, so our personas are political strategy advisor, US aid worker, and administrator. I have a collection of different pages that I'm using for each of those personas, okay? And then all of the pages get the about page, or sorry, all of the users get to see the about page, and everyone gets a log out button, okay? So let's go back. I'm going to keep that open. Let's go back to home.py. So and what you see here, I've added a bunch of comments that don't exist in your repo. However, I did push them to the template repo, so you can, at least from the forked repository, you can pull the changes in, or you can just look on the look in the repo in your browser and check them out. Okay, so basically, I'm importing Streamlit. This stuff up here is for logging. I'm importing Streamlit. I am importing that sidebar link function. So let's see, this right here, I'm importing that from modules.nav. So modules nav. I set the layout for the Streamlit page to be wide. Otherwise, it's a pretty narrow look and feel, a much more narrow UI. And then as soon as somebody comes to the home page, I automatically say that they have not been authenticated. So I set authenticated to false. Now, the session state variable, it's a dictionary, is part of Streamlit that can be used, among other things, to pass information between pages. So remember, I talked about HTTP and by extension to some degree Streamlit, page to page or request to request. It's a stateless application or a stateless protocol. But we can use this session state to essentially, for one user logged in, track some information. You'll see I'll add some other information later. But initially, all users are authenticated to false, or their authenticated value is set to false. Then I come down and I call that sidebar links, and because I'm on the home page, I want to set it to true. So I set home to true. And then we get to the kind of the meat and potatoes of the page. So we start with a logging function, and then we set the title of the page, and then we basically write a little functions, what you've seen if you've run the application. Okay. Now, this sample application had 3 user personas: a political strategy advisor, a US aid worker, and an administrator, system administrator. Now, I didn't comment, because it's the same comments for the US aid worker administrator, but you'll notice I added comments in the political strategy advisor. Whenever somebody is to click that particular button, this would be equivalent, clicking the button in our application would be equivalent to somebody logging in with a username and password, and that password, username and password pair getting authenticated. So once that happens, we set authenticated to true, and then we set the role of this particular person to political strategy advisor. And we're setting up a super simple, what it's called as a rule-based access control, RBAC system. So in other pages, we'll be able to check the user's role to see if they maybe have access to something or whatnot. And then we set the user's first name because we want to make the application more personalized as a particular user is exploring. Then I do another logging statement. And once I've set these variables, then I can switch to the home page for the political strategy advisor. So this page is the home page for essentially the entire application, and then we have a landing page or home page for each persona. So if I were to look at that, that would be this one. Okay. So, and it's also just essentially a collection of buttons. We do the same thing. We import Streamlit. We need the sidebar links. We want to set it to wide layout. We display the sidebar links. But now in the sidebar links function, it's going to be able to access this particular variable, the role variable of session state. So it's only going to add these three things to the sidebar. All right. This is where we're using first name, which we set to make it a little more personalized. And we give them some buttons that redirect or switch to some other pages, the World Bank visualization and the map demo visualization. Okay. So that's kind of the lay of the land. What I'd like to do first is add a simple page to the Streamlit application so that you can see the process I would go through to add that. And I will handle that in the next video.